The Undertaker Hauntings, written and read by Tony Capobianco. Late one cold September night, a teenage boy was driving home from his friend's house. Shadowy trees blurred by as he texted a friend while he drove. The car drifted a little each time that he read a text. Every time that the boy typed a response, his car swerved. Music blaring from the car speakers spoke to his soul in a way that nothing else could. As the beat of the music accelerated, so too did the speed of the car. He turned up the volume and sped up even more. A carefree thrill swept over him. After looking down at his phone to read a text about a girl that he had a crush on, he looked back up to the road. Fog suddenly rolled in and began to blanket the country back road. Decelerating slightly, the boy once again read a text message that he had received, and yet again his car drifted over the yellow line. Glancing up at his rear-view mirror, he saw a team of black horses pulling a black carriage. The carriage had red lanterns which lit the path before it. Pale light from the moon caused the fog to take on an otherworldly appearance. A tall man in a top hat drove the horse and carriage. The boy began to breathe rapidly as he realized that the horse and carriage was gaining on him, even though he was driving over 50 miles per hour. It wasn't possible, and yet it was happening. As the black horse and carriage drew closer, the boy saw that fiery flames were coming from the eyes of the horses. Adding to the macabre sight, the black horses were missing 40% of their flesh. Seeing the exposed bones of the horse's legs, ribs, and skull caused the boy's eyes to double in size. Instantly, the atmosphere in his car changed from joy to terror. The car swerved as the panicked boy tried to navigate through the fog while fleeing from the terrifying horse and carriage. His phone chimed as a new text message notification appeared. The message said that it came from the Undertaker. A photo of a tall man dressed in the attire of a mortician from the 1800s accompanied a message that read, "Deadly thrills, texting kills." Not wearing a seatbelt, the boy's head violently smashed into and crashed through the windshield. Glass severely shred his youthful face. Like a missile, the force of the high-speed impact propelled his body into a large tree. Dead on impact, the lifeless body was enshrouded by the fog. The spectral mortician brought his horse and carriage of death to a stop. Slowly, he stood up and stepped down onto the ground. Methodically walking through the fog, the ghostly Undertaker reached the bloody corpse and ripped out its soul. With a death grip, the ghostly Undertaker dragged the soul of the boy to the death carriage, threw him inside, and locked it up. Climbing back into the carriage, the Undertaker rode through the fog until the ground opened and swallowed them up. The poor young man was not the only person unfortunate enough to encounter the supernatural Undertaker. The grim reaper of souls in the appearance of an undead Undertaker has appeared to many people. A beautiful 21-year-old young woman was driving 80 miles per hour on her way home from work. After checking text messages from her boyfriend, she looked into her rear-view mirror and saw him. Riding on horseback, it appeared like they were flying down the highway. No one but the girl seemed to have seen him. The Phantom Undertaker was right behind her when he sent her a text message saying, "Roses are dead, and I'm going to take your head." The ghostly mortician jumped over her car and vanished into thin air. Shaking from her head to her toes, she hadn't seen the message from the Undertaker until she parked her car in her driveway. The young woman thought that she must have hallucinated the frightful encounter. A short time later, the young woman was driving to the mall to go shopping. It was night. Driving 90 miles per hour in her convertible with the top down, the wind blew through her hair. She had just heard her boyfriend tell her for the first time that he loved her. Never before had she felt happier or more alive. Love and happiness exploded inside of her with the intensity of nuclear fusion. Life, in that moment, felt like the kind of dream that she never wanted to be over. The young woman's phone vibrated and notified her of a text from her boyfriend. Feeling like she was walking on air, she excitedly picked up her phone and read the message. After responding and texting back and forth, she received a message from someone else. Her heart sank into her stomach. It was from the Undertaker. The message read, "I'm back, and I'm ready to hack." Trembling all over, the beautiful young woman looked behind her and saw him. This time, the fiendish mortician was driving the black horse and carriage of death. Pale was the color of his skin. Terrible was the look in his undead eyes. Tears flowed down her face. Flying down the highway like a jet plane, she tried to outrun the ghastly carriage from hell. It was no use. The Undertaker was right behind her. It seemed like he was toying with her. Desperate, the young woman honked her horn, hoping that someone could help her. Though she drove like a race car driver and furiously honked her horn, it was to no avail. No one besides her could see the vengeful spirit of death that stalked her down the highway. Even if someone had been able to see what was happening to her, what could they have done? How do you fight death? In battles against death, death is undefeated. Looking in the rearview mirror and seeing the ghoulish Undertaker driving the hellish horse and carriage, her heart nearly beat through her chest. No matter how fast she drove, he matched her pace. Not knowing how such a thing could even be possible added to her intense fear. Being chased by a deranged mortal man would have been frightening, but being chased by a supernatural being was extremely terrifying. The young woman knew that her life was about to come to a violent end. Drowning in despair, she accepted her bleak fate. The look on her face simultaneously conveyed deep sorrow and emptiness. That facial expression was to be the last one that she would ever wear. At that very moment, the black carriage of death pulled up beside her. The Taker of Lives pulled out a large sword, and then, in one fell swoop, he lopped off her head. The severed head of the young woman went flying into the air until it went through an open window and dropped on the lap of a horrified driver. With its driver headless, the convertible crashed through a guardrail, fell 20 feet, and then repeatedly rolled over. When the wrecked car finally came to a stop, the black horse and carriage pulled up next to it. The Reaper of Souls methodically stepped up to the car, reached inside, and ripped the young woman's soul from her corpse. With her soul in hand, the Undertaker walked back to the carriage and detained her there. The spirit of death had completed his gruesome mission, and it was time for him to return to the underworld. The ground opened up and swallowed the black carriage of death. The unfortunate young woman in the convertible wasn't the last soul taken by the funeral director of the underworld. Young men and women weren't the only ones to draw the gaze of the death driver. The undead Undertaker is not one to discriminate on account of age, sex, income, race, or creed. The Reaper of Souls is an equal opportunity destroyer. A popular 31-year-old podcaster smoked a blunt while driving his sports car. The weed was potent. He was as high as a drone in the sky. Although he was driving on a road that he knew like the back of his hand, he was unsure of exactly where he was, or even how long he had been driving. His brain was far from firing on all cylinders. paranoia had begun to set in. Afraid that the police might spot him and pull him over, he nervously searched his rearview mirror. Images of blue and red flashing lights played in his mind. To his amazement, instead of flashing police lights, he saw floating red lanterns. Laughing as he watched the floating lanterns, he continued to drive. Relieved that the sight had to have been a product of the drugs, he tried to enjoy the hallucination. As the red floating lanterns drew near, he saw that they were flying above a black horse and carriage. The Undertaker sat in the driver's seat of the carriage. The podcaster continued to laugh because he believed that he had smoked the best weed that he had ever had. Laughing his head off, he continued to smoke his blunt. The smoke in the car had become so thick that he hadn't noticed the developing fog outside. His phone vibrated and alerted him of an incoming text message. The message was from the underworld mortician. The message said, "Driving high, now you die." A cold chill went through the podcaster. He felt as though someone had walked over his grave. The undead driver had sent the podcaster a picture of himself as well. The stoned podcaster looked at the picture on his phone, and then he looked at the ghoulish figure that was driving the carriage behind him. The driver was no ordinary man. He was tall and he looked to have been dead for a long time. Yet, he appeared to be very much alive. The floating lanterns further fueled the man's fear. Having realized that hallucinations can't send text messages, he tried to outrun the horrifying black carriage. The Undertaker raced forward and pulled up beside the podcaster. When the podcaster looked to his left and saw the Undertaker up close, he lost control of his bladder and urinated on himself. The undead mortician grinned and smashed his hand through the driver's side window. Grabbing the terrified podcaster by the neck, he choked him briefly, and then crushed his throat. The Undertaker of the underworld ripped out the man's soul and stored it in the carriage. The podcaster's car then drove off of the road and went off of a cliff. With the podcaster's soul locked up, the earth opened up to allow the Grim Reaper of Death to return to the underworld. Drinking in a bar, a man boasted of how he had outsmarted the law. At 42 years of age, he looked to be 10 years older. Years of heavy drinking and hard living had not treated his body well, and it showed. When drinking, he always liked to tell anyone within earshot that he got his taste for drinking from his father. Unlike his father, however, he was a functioning alcoholic. His excessive drinking hadn't yet cost him his livelihood. Drinking wasn't the only thing that he had in common with his monster for a father. Both father and son treated women like objects to be used and abused, and they both shared a violent temper. Another thing that they secretly shared in common was that both father and son had killed someone. Each had driven drunk and killed innocent people. Unlike the father, the son had managed to elude arrest. Having amassed a small fortune through shady real estate deals, his narcissism grew like uncontrolled weeds. Believing that he was smarter and superior to everyone else, he thought that the law didn't apply to him. To his mind, the law existed to keep weak-minded sheep within their fences. Having gotten away with drinking and driving, committing assaults, child abuse, theft, and murder, he came to believe that he was untouchable. Feeling that he was above the law, he viewed himself as a god. To his psychopathic mind, other people were nothing more than objects and possessions for him to exploit. The ultimate opportunist, he was always scheming and looking to manipulate. Over the years, the sociopath had left a trail of pain and tears in his wake. Some of his victims were so emotionally destroyed that they turned to things that society might consider to be forbidden. The mother of the young man who had been killed by a drunk driver was one such soul. The man responsible for her son's death had never been apprehended, put on trial, or sent to jail. The loss of her beautiful son was the most painful thing that she ever had to go through. A parent should never have to bury their child. The loss fractured her soul and brought on a deep, persistent depression. The burning rage inside of her boiled over. Desiring justice and revenge, she cried out to an ancient deity. Night after night, she begged for divine intervention. She beseeched Orcus, the god of death and punishment, for help. The grieving mother wasn't the only person that prayed for help. The sociopath's own son pleaded for help each and every night. The 12-year-old boy was tired of suffering beatings at the hands of his monstrous father. The broken bones, the bruises, and the bloody noses had a cumulative effect on the boy. At a time in which he should have been happy, safe, and innocent, he was depressed, victimized, and emotionally tarnished. Desperate for help, he cried out to any spirit or deity that would listen. Their prayers did not go unheard. The god of death and punishment, the lord of the underworld, took action. He dispatched the Undertaker of the underworld to exact justice and punishment. The guilty sociopath left the bar for the last time. Staggering to his car, he was very drunk. He started the car and drove away. After running through a red light, he swerved all over the road. The time was late. The ghostly black carriage appeared behind the drunken sociopath. The man was so intoxicated that he was oblivious to the supernatural presence behind him. The undead mortician pulled up beside him and grinned as the man turned and looked at him. The man's face grew white as a bleached sheet. A freezing cold chill shot down his spine. The jolt of fear almost seemed to have sobered him up a bit. Or perhaps it was the magic of the Undertaker that caused him to sober up some. After all, the Death Reaper wanted this cruel man to feel what was about to happen to him. The Undertaker caused the man's car to crash into a tree. The horn sounded as the man's head leaned up against it. The ghoul from the underworld meticulously stepped toward the man in the car. As he drew near, the man opened his eyes. Losing control of his bowels, he soiled his pants. For the first time in his miserable life, he cried. He never cried for the loss of a friend or a family member. Never had he cried in empathy for another. On that fateful night, he cried for himself. He found out the hard way that he wasn't a god. He wasn't even an impressive human being. Whimpering and shaking, he crawled on his knees and begged for mercy. Groveling before the wrathful Undertaker of the underworld, he tasted the pain and helplessness that he had caused his victims to feel. Without mercy, the ghastly Undertaker looked at the pathetic man and said, "Your time has come. You evaded serving hard time. Now I'm going to rip out your spine." True to his word, the Reaper of Death sunk his hands into the top of the man's back. Then, a crackling sound was followed by the ripping out of the spine. Blood poured off of the spine. The man's body collapsed to the floor. The Undertaker then ripped out the guilty man's soul and dragged it into the black carriage. Taking his place on the driver's seat of the death carriage, the Undertaker drove into the underworld to deliver that particular soul to Orcus himself. The Lord of the Underworld had special plans for the sociopath. Horrible punishments and torments awaited him. The mortician of the Underworld watches our roads. Next time you're driving, think twice about responding to text messages. If not, the next text that you receive might be from the undead Undertaker. Whatever you do, don't give him a reason to reap your soul and to drag you to the underworld. Thanks for stopping by the haunted Half Moon Inn. I hope that you have enjoyed your stay. Before you go, please put a wooden stake through the like button and leave a comment for the spirits to read. If you did enjoy your time with us, subscribe to this undead channel. Doing those little things really helps me to reach more souls. The world is sick and hurting. It needs more horror. Help me to heal the world through horror. Together, we can haunt this world one home at a time. And always remember, just because you don't see them doesn't mean that they aren't there.